This is possibly the most historically significant building in Taipei. It's located near the train station and the presidential office, and it's not too far from some famous tourist attractions. But you might not have heard of it. If you work in Taiwan, it's related to your new holiday, or rather your reinstated old holiday. This is Zhongshan Hall, built during the Japanese colonial period in 1936, when it was called Taipei City Hall. This is the building where the transfer of sovereignty over Taiwan happened on October 25th, 1945. This was when the last Japanese governor left office and the Republic of China, the current government of Taiwan, began governing Taiwan. This month marks the 80th anniversary of what's called the Retrocession of Taiwan in English. If you want to understand what's going on with Taiwan today and its relation to China, the two most important years are 1945 and 1949. This video is about what happened in 1945, and I plan on making a future video on what happened in 1949. So what was going on in Taiwan in 1945? Well, the same thing that was going on in the rest of the world. While World War II lasted less than 4 years for America and 6 years for Britain, it lasted more than 8 years for Taiwan. This is because Taiwan was a colony of Japan. And by the time of Pearl Harbor, Japan had already been at war for 4 years, fighting against China, the Republic of China, the current government of Taiwan. But most of Taiwan's population was ethnically Han Chinese, not Japanese. So the colonial government implemented the Kominka or Japanization policy. Only Japanese could be used on the radio or in the newspapers. Before the 1930s, the use of Chinese was allowed. Taiwanese were encouraged to speak only Japanese and change their names to Japanese names. This is why very old Taiwanese people can often speak Japanese. As the war dragged on, an American invasion of Taiwan became a possibility. There were plans drawn up called Operation Causeway, but Douglas MacArthur said, "Nah, we're invading the Philippines instead." That was a good decision. But American planes would bomb Taiwan starting in 1944. The Taiwanese people were put to work constructing tunnels and fortifications for the very real American air raids, as well as a hypothetical future American landing on Taiwan. Allied POWs were working in the mines, and there was an order to execute them as soon as Allied soldiers landed on the island. The local Taiwanese, previously exempted from conscription, were now being drafted. This showed increasing desperation, because at the beginning of the war, the Japanese army didn't trust the Taiwanese and relegated them to non-combat roles. By 1945, the Axis was decisively losing the war, but Japan was not about to surrender. The goal shifted to inflicting such high casualties on the Allies that they would eventually drop their demand for an unconditional surrender. General Rikichi Ando, the first of the two main characters of this story, was appointed governor of Taiwan at the end of 1944 and was tasked with defending the island. Everyone was to be mobilized into the war effort. Kids were doing air raid drills at school. Some Taiwanese women left Taiwan to serve as nurses. Men from 15 to 60 and women from 17 to 40 were organized into civil defense corps. The quality of life for civilians was getting worse. Taiwan had a heavily agricultural economy and had been exporting rice to Japan, but now there was a rice shortage in Taiwan itself. Many had to turn to the black market to survive. Meanwhile, American bombing raids continued. The U.S. Air Force faced no opposition as Japanese pilots were needed to defend the home islands. Ando's subordinates took out their anger on their prisoners, executing 14 American POWs. This was in June 1945, the same month that America won the Battle of Okinawa. And Okinawa isn't very far from Taiwan, and the Japanese stationed in Taiwan had every reason to believe that an invasion of Taiwan was coming. But less than 2 months later, America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union entered the war as well. On August 15th, Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced that Japan would surrender. There were some in the Japanese military, including some in Taiwan, who wanted to continue fighting. Rikichi Ando was not one of them. As part of the terms of surrender, Japan had to give up all of its overseas empire. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony for 50 years, beginning with Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. As part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Qing dynasty gave up Taiwan. When the Japanese army arrived in Taiwan, some Qing soldiers and local militias put up a brave but doomed resistance for a few months. The coming decades would see continued resistance to Japanese rule, both from the Han Chinese majority and indigenous Austronesian minority. Japanese rule over Taiwan was more lenient than in other parts of its empire, and it brought modernization and development. But it also brought oppression, especially for the indigenous population. Nevertheless, some Taiwanese had thrown their lot in with Japan. Over 200,000 Taiwanese fought for Japan, and more worked in wartime industries. Eventually, people were drafted, but for most of the war, Taiwanese soldiers were volunteers. Some Taiwanese youths were convinced to go to Japan to work in the factories with the promise that after the war, they could go to university. Future President Lee Teng-hui was among those who served in the Japanese armed forces, going under the Japanese name Iwasato Masao. The last confirmed Japanese holdout was a Taiwanese man who did not surrender until 1974. Other Taiwanese fought for or otherwise supported China. It was difficult to do this if you actually lived in Taiwan, of course, but there were Taiwanese exile groups in China, and some of them called for making Taiwan a province of the Republic of China. There were also Taiwan-born members of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Kuomintang and Mao Zedong's Communist Party. The two parties had been involved in a civil war that was put on hold due to the Japanese invasion of China. Some of the Taiwanese exiles had been organized into the Taiwan Volunteer Army. With Japan's surrender, World War II was over. The majority of Taiwanese were happy that the war was over and that Japanese rule was about to end. Wu Xinrong, a doctor, upon hearing news of the surrender, jumped into a river and exclaimed, "Wash away the dust of 10 years of war and the sweat of 50 years. From today on, we will start a new life." Others were more conflicted. There were people who had staked their hopes on Japan winning the war and being rewarded for their service to the Japanese Empire. Chen Chen Chen, one of the youth workers in Japan, would say, My feelings were quite complicated. On one hand, I was very happy that I could finally return to Taiwan. On the other, I was surprised. How could we have lost the war? Weren't we working so hard every day? Japan was to be occupied, and its entire empire was to be dismantled, and its overseas possessions were to be given back to whoever they had been taken from. Taiwan had been captured from the Qing dynasty, but in 1945, the Qing dynasty no longer existed. In 1912, the last Chinese emperor abdicated. Or more accurately, his handlers forced him to abdicate. He was 6 years old and didn't really understand anything that was going on. The Republic of China was established and became the internationally recognized government of China. The Republic of China, the ROC, became the successor and inheritor of the Qing dynasty. Thus, the Republic of China inherited the Treaty of Shimonoseki, in which the Qing dynasty had relinquished control over Taiwan. During World War II, the Republic of China was led by Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist Kuomintang Party. In 1943, he declared that China's century of humiliation, which saw China repeatedly lose wars and territory to the European powers and Japan, had come to an end. Later that year, he met with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in Cairo to discuss the war against Japan. There, Chiang Kai-shek abrogated the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and the Allies agreed that all territories Japan had taken from China would be returned. In July 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, declaring that Japan would have to comply with the terms set out in Cairo. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan was going to surrender and comply with the Potsdam Declaration. This is the basis that the Republic of China used to legitimize its rule over Taiwan. But the change in administration couldn't be done quickly. Japanese authorities continued to govern Taiwan until October 25th, meaning that there were 2 months and 10 days in between the emperor's broadcast of surrender and the actual end of Japanese rule. What happened during those 2 months? When Japan surrendered, it still controlled a large swath of Chinese territory and most of its major cities. Japanese soldiers were ordered to stay put and wait until Chinese soldiers arrived and then lay down their arms. They were specifically instructed to surrender to Chiang Kai-shek's National Revolutionary Army and not the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army led by Mao Zedong. The Japanese soldiers in Taiwan were also ordered to stay put and wait for Chinese soldiers to come and disarm them. The official surrender of Japan on board the USS Missouri took place on September 2nd, but Chinese soldiers wouldn't arrive in Taiwan until October 15th. Rikichi Ando made sure that the transition period went smoothly. He made sure that there wouldn't be any Japanese holdouts in Taiwan. There are some reports of Taiwanese civilians enacting revenge against Japanese policemen, but these were isolated incidents and we don't have much information about them. Overall, the transition period was peaceful. One notable incident that happened in Taiwan was the death of Subhas Chandra Bose on August 18, 1945. Bose was the leader of the Indian National Army, a collaborationist army that worked with Japan to secure India's independence from Britain. When Bose heard of the surrender, he was in Japanese-occupied Singapore. He decided his best course of action was to flee to the Soviet Union, and Taipei was on his flight path. But his plane crashed shortly after taking off from the airport in Taipei, fatally injuring him. On August 19th, Chiang Kai-shek chose Chen Yi, a Chinese general with a Japanese wife, to be the future governor of Taiwan. He's the second of the two main characters of this story. Chen, like many other Chinese military and political figures of that period, had spent time in Japan. In 1935, he visited Taiwan to attend an exposition on the 40th anniversary of Japanese colonial rule, and noted how modernized Taiwan was compared to war-torn mainland China. Allied planes continued to fly over Taiwan in the weeks after August 15th, but these were not dropping bombs. Instead, they were dropping food for the thousands of POWs held in Taiwan. By September 12th, all POWs were evacuated from Taiwan. There was possibly a movement among Taiwanese elites, maybe with some Japanese support, to prevent the Republic of China from taking over Taiwan by creating an independent Republic of Taiwan. There are conflicting reports. Some sources say that the movement didn't exist at all. Others say that it did exist, but Rikichi Ando shut it down. This is all based on hearsay, and there's no concrete evidence that this movement existed. In China, on October 10th, rivals Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong signed the Double Tenth Agreement that was supposed to establish peace between the Chinese nationalists and communists. October 10th, Double Ten Day, is currently a national holiday in Taiwan. It commemorates the beginning of the rebellion that overthrew the last Chinese emperor and led to the establishment of the Republic of China. Spoiler alert, the peace didn't last very long. In Taiwan, on October 10th, there were makeshift celebrations of Double Ten Day. The Japanese army and police did not interfere. The newspaper Minbao started publication, and Taiwanese were allowed to read newspapers in Chinese once again. I should note that the people working on the paper were almost certainly speaking Taiwanese Hokkien, not Mandarin, but the same Chinese characters can be used to write both. On October 15th, over 12,000 Chinese soldiers transported on American ships arrived in the port city of Keelung. The 200,000 Japanese soldiers in Taiwan were disarmed without incident. On October 24th, Chinese General Chen Yi arrived. On October 25th, the Retrocession ceremony took place here in Taipei City Hall, as it was called back then, formalizing the transition of power. Taipei City Hall was undamaged by the American bombing raids, despite the nearby buildings being damaged or destroyed. Crowds of Taiwanese gathered outside the building. There were representatives of China and Japan present, but also of the Taiwanese people and the Americans. The Allied flags of the Soviet Union, United States, Republic of China, and the United Kingdom were on display. In the American delegation was George Kerr, who would later write a book called Formosa Betrayed, the only well-known book about this era in Taiwan that's written in English. To say that he hated the incoming Chinese administration would be an understatement. Rikichi Ando signed the surrender document. Then, at 10 a.m., Ando's chief of staff, Haruki Isayama, handed over the document to Chen Yi, the new governor of Taiwan. Chen Yi gave a radio address announcing that Taiwan had been liberated and returned to China. George Kerr was upset that Chen Yi's speech made it sound like China, and not the United States, had won the war against Japan. He described Chen's wife Yoshiko as his plump Japanese mistress. This event is called the Retrocession of Taiwan, or Taiwan Guangfu in Chinese. Guangfu literally means recovery. and would later be used by Chiang Kai-shek to describe his desire to recover Chinese territory he would later lose to the communists. Retrocession Day became a national holiday, but it was politically controversial. And in 2000, it was removed as a public holiday because it was seen as too Chinese. But this year, 2025, it was reinstated as Taiwan Retrocession and Victory in the Battle of Guningtou Day. More on the Battle of Guningtou when I make my video on 1949. And this building here was renamed from Taipei City Hall to Zhongshan Hall, named after Sun Zhongshan. Here's a statue of him right outside Zhongshan Hall. If you don't speak Chinese, you may still know him as Sun Yat-sen, a Chinese revolutionary who was behind the overthrow of the last emperor and the establishment of the Republic of China. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong saw themselves as the rightful heir of Sun's revolutionary ideas. Sun has a portrait in Taiwan's legislature, as well as Tiananmen Square in Beijing. So he's pretty widely admired as a Chinese hero. Anyway, the surrender happened on the second floor. You can go to the second floor, but the room where it happened is off limits. This is apparently what the room looked like in 2005. Chiang Kai-shek was quite fond of this building and held 3 of his 5 inaugurations at Zhongshan Hall. He and his wife Sun Meiling used to like to drink coffee here. The building hasn't been used for government purposes in decades, and is now used for art exhibitions and musical performances. There was an official song for the Taiwan Retrocession, because why not? I'll play a little bit of it now. But what did all this mean for the people in Taiwan? For most of the over 300,000 Japanese living in Taiwan, it meant repatriation or deportation. Likewise, Taiwanese were being repatriated to Taiwan. Though not everyone was happy, it's generally agreed that the majority were. There were lots of celebrations, there were fireworks, a parade, and festivities that lasted for a week. The general atmosphere of happiness didn't last forever, and soon tensions arose between the Taiwanese and the newly arrived Chinese mainlanders. From the perspective of the mainlanders, many of the Taiwanese, particularly the elite, had collaborated with Japan, the country they had just fought a very bloody war with for the last 8 years, where millions of Chinese were killed. Chiang Kai-shek said that the Chinese people should forgive the Japanese, and that the war had been against the Japanese militarist government, not the Japanese people. He was a lot less forgiving to those who are called in Mandarin Hanjian, Chinese traitors, people who had betrayed their country to aid Japan. Most Taiwanese were of the Han ethnicity, and a lot of them had worked for Japan. In January 1946, the Judicial Yuan, the Chinese Supreme Court, ruled that Taiwanese could not legally be classified as Hanjian because they were Japanese citizens. On paper, they were exempt, but in practice, they were not. Governor Chen Yi wanted to hunt down collaborators, and he arrested several prominent Taiwanese. Some people think that these arrests were done for political reasons. The local Taiwanese had their own problems with the mainlanders. Most Taiwanese couldn't speak Mandarin, the new official language in Taiwan. There was also some corruption and economic mismanagement by the new government. The tensions between mainlanders and Taiwanese reached a boiling point in 1947 when a government agent shot and killed a protester, which led to an uprising against the government on February 28th. Up to 28,000 people were killed in what's called the 228 incident. Wu Xinrong, who was mentioned earlier as celebrating the end of Japanese rule, was arrested during this incident. The Taiwanese newspaper Minbao was shut down. Around this time, a well-documented Taiwanese independence movement was formed. The 228 Peace Park is close to Zhongshan Hall and is named after the 228 incident. A lot of the internal political divisions in Taiwan today come from the events of 1945 and the following years, but I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole in this video. When Taiwan became part of the Republic of China, the Taiwanese were transformed from citizens of a losing power to citizens of a victorious power. But even though one war had ended, another one was starting back up. Remember the peace talks between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong? Well, those didn't last very long, and in 1946, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists resumed, and now Taiwan was part of it. Chiang Kai-shek didn't know it at the time, but Taiwan was about to be his new home. By 1949, Mao Zedong was obviously winning this conflict, so Chiang Kai-shek took himself, his family, his government, his gold, his army, and many Chinese civilians to Taiwan. The Republic of China's capital was now Taipei. Pretty soon, Taiwan and a few other islands were all that was left of the Republic of China, which is why today, Taiwan and Republic of China are typically used interchangeably. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China over the territory he won in the Civil War. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong hated each other, but they agreed on two things: that Taiwan was part of China, and that China should be united. They just disagreed on who should rule China, but more on that in my future video on 1949. And what about Rikichi Ando and Chen Yi? Within 5 years, both of them would be dead, and neither of them died peacefully. General Rikichi Ando, the last Japanese governor of Taiwan, was arrested for war crimes on April 13th, 1946. This was for his actions in southern China earlier in the war, though some of his underlings would be tried and executed for their actions in Taiwan. 6 days later, he ended his life by cyanide, though some claimed that he was actually murdered. Chen Yi, who took over from Rikichi Ando, served as governor until April 1947, when he was removed from his post by Chiang Kai-shek for his handling of the 228 incident and because he was utterly despised by the Taiwanese people. He was made governor of his home province of Zhejiang until it was discovered that he was planning to surrender to the communists. Chen was arrested, dragged to Taiwan by Chiang Kai-shek, and tried and executed in Taiwan. On June 18, 1950, he was executed by firing squad. According to a 2014 interview with one of his executioners, Chen Yi's last words were, I am dead. My spirit is not dead, and the blood I shed is the blood shed for the 18 million comrades in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hangzhou. He was cremated, and in 2011, his remains were secretly carried from Taiwan to Hangzhou. According to Chiang Kai-shek biographer J. Taylor, Chen Yi invited Chiang Kai-shek to dinner after Chiang Kai-shek had decided he was going to arrest and kill Chen, but before he carried out the orders. He accepted the invitation and he, along with his son and grandchildren, actually went to the dinner. Must have been really awkward. So in 1945, Taiwan was handed over from Japan to the Republic of China. In 1949, the Republic of China itself was relocated to Taiwan. These maps should explain the situation. Stay tuned for a video on 1949 and the biggest evacuation in human history. Hopefully that one is better and isn't rushed in order to be on time for an anniversary like this one was. As an addendum, I would like to point out that Japan is actually viewed very favorably by most Taiwanese today. And about Zhongshan Hall, my tour guide was very helpful. You can go in and about 3 times a day, there's a guided tour, but you can only get that in Chinese. There are audio tours in English and Japanese as well. Anyway, for any Taiwanese people watching this video, I want to know what you think about Retrocession Day, about Japan's colonial legacy in Taiwan, and anything else related to that. Oh, and I can't believe I almost forgot, but I have to give a big shout out to World War II Database for their large collection of royalty-free images.